Just because Keystone Park is no longer open to the public starting at 6 p.m. doesn't necessarily mean that the workday is even close to being over. The animals who live at Keystone Park don't get to hop in their cars at the end of their visit and go back home. And this means our keepers don't get to go home right away either. They have to stay back and do some extra work. Being a zookeeper truly is one of those jobs that not just anybody can do. It takes a certain breed. Though the work is incredibly difficult, seeing the animals grow, develop, and learn right before your eyes really does make it all worth it. This doesn't make the work any less backbreaking though, and any keeper will tell you that you have to treasure the few moments a day you get to sit down. These moments don't happen often, especially when something spectacular forces your action. Today, Keystone Park's keeper staff greeted our expedition team. They've recently returned from a long trek to South America, returning with heaps of knowledge that's sure to be helpful. They also were sure to bring with them 2 beautiful red-eyed tree frogs. Luckily, they adjusted to their home relatively easily. Being able to study this brand new amphibian in a controlled environment is going to be incredibly helpful to all zoos local. With the arrival of the red-eyed tree frog, this also means that the reptile house is officially 100% complete. Every slot is taken by an animal, whether it be a reptile or an amphibian. On our journey to South America, we were incredibly fortunate to be able to visit various other zoos and wildlife reserves local to the region. For the most part, these locations were incredibly beautiful. Despite their beauty, these locations were not without their fair share of problems. Just as our team was packing up, under the cover of darkness, dozens of protesters showed up. After talking to one of them, they informed us that the wildlife reserve that we were visiting had subpar living conditions for a few of their black and white ruffed lemurs. Unfortunately, this issue extends past South America. Other expedition teams are reporting sites of protesters all around the world. There seems to be a growing demand that zoos focus less on profits and more about conservation efforts. Profits are certainly important to a zoo's well-being. If you don't have a profit flow and steady income, you can't take care of the animals, and if you can't take care of your animals, you have no conservation efforts to apply. Despite understanding full well the importance of a profit, Keystone Park also understands the importance of conservation, which is why we're incredibly happy to announce the beginning of the Keystone Wetland Initiative. Despite the project not being named until now, we've actually already started. That's because last month, one of our oldest animals at Keystone Park, our beaver Willow, actually gave birth to baby Bobby. Now the birth of baby Bobby actually gave me an incredible idea to help motivate us on our conservation journey. The beavers are the main animal of the Keystone Wetland Initiative, and I decided to make 3 goals. The first goal was to breed the target animal, which we were successful with. This task awards us with a bronze badge. The silver badge will be awarded when Bobby matures and is released to the wild or has offspring of his own here. The gold badge is by far the hardest to obtain. In order to get this, we're going to have a beaver with perfect stats across the board. In terms of conservation, this is going to ensure that the best possible genetics are being spread around. Sandbox mode can get a little bit easy from time to time, so I thought it would be incredibly fun to impose this little side quest upon myself, and have some rewards for doing so. Once we do breed a statistically and genetically perfect beaver, we'll then move on to another conservation project. In case you missed the last episode, we built an incredible capybara enclosure, home to 4 capybara, 3 male and a female. Their names, along with the names of the 7 giant otter we built for 2 episodes ago, are going to be revealed at the end of the South American section with the updated tour of Keystone Park. So leave comments if you have names for any animals that we're building for. The community we're rapidly growing here is truly something special. I love seeing your creative comments for the names of the animals that call Keystone Park home. If you'd love to join this community, we'd love to have you, so feel free to like and subscribe. Not to get ahead of myself, but I think today's build is my favorite I've ever done in the game, so be sure to stick around to the end of the video, you won't regret it. We recently completed the Amazon River, which is a subsection of South America as a whole. Keystone Park's newest addition is home to the spectacled caiman, the dwarf caiman, the giant otter, and as of last episode, the capybara. This section of the zoo is easily the most lush and vibrant with plant life that we have so far. Comparing it to our North American section, it's really night and day. However, I think we can go a little bit further. With the Amazon River complete for now, today we need to start on the second section of South America, the rainforest. If you thought the river was lush, you haven't seen anything yet. The Amazon River and the rainforest are next door neighbors. They're incredibly close to each other, only being separated by one exhibit, which we're going to be building today. The capybara enclosure's runoff water is actually leading into the waterfall of today's animal. It's certainly not the biggest exhibit ever, however the animal that's going to call this home is solitary and doesn't require a whole lot of space. Before even beginning construction on the rainforest, I realized that it's going to be incredibly close to the parking lot. We want to disrupt the view of the guests before they get into the zoo. The first thing we did to accomplish this was build a small retaining wall made out of natural rocks. We've been using a lot of faux rocks lately, so I wanted to break it up. I added a few trees and a few bushes just to begin the foliage process. I then designed a very simple curve, literally using just 2 pieces, a slab of concrete and a slab of wood. I then used this to separate the hard jagged rocks from the parking lot. The last step I did was fill in a bunch of empty spaces with some tall grass. This certainly looks a lot better already. Now guests that park in the lot aren't going to necessarily know exactly what's back here. We can hide a bunch of South American foliage and the guest won't be spoiled. This zoo is in North America, so we used a lot of the North American foliage almost as a shield for what's going to be behind here. Speaking of what's actually going to be behind here, I think now we can officially start on today's habitat. But what animal is going to call this home? Meet the giant anteater. This is one of the species that we actually learned about on our recent South American expedition, and now we know enough about them to build them an effective habitat. Unfortunately, we also learned that there are vulnerable species, with less than 5,000 left in the wild due to a variety of reasons. According to the Zoopedia, the anteater should be relatively basic to build for. They don't need any climbing requirement, deep dive water, or water in general. The Zoopedia doesn't explicitly state this, but the reason that they don't need any climbing requirement is pretty obvious if you know some geography. The left side of South America is incredibly mountainous, and look where their habitat is. It's all the way on the east, nowhere near the left. This means that the giant anteater cannot exist in mountainous regions, so therefore we can't include any climbing for them, not even if we wanted to. Giant anteaters are solitary animals, and typically will live alone, with the exception of a mother and her young. This is a pretty well-known fact, and not surprising at all. What is surprising, however, is that guests can actually enter the habitat according to the Zoopedia. The reason I find this surprising is for two reasons. One, anteaters have incredibly poor eyesight. Pair this with the fact that they live with jaguars, anteater can be a little bit trigger-happy. But what are they using to attack? What's a lesser-known fact about anteaters is that they have claws that rival the size and power of a grizzly bear's. You don't want to get hit by one. Other than their lethal claws, anteaters are relatively harmless. Matter of fact, the only thing an anteater is a threat to is obviously an insect, particularly an ant. Obviously, a single ant doesn't have very much nutritional value. That's why anteaters can actually eat up to 30,000 of them a day. We're gonna have to have a lot of ants at Keystone Park. Despite their poor eyesight and pretty intense weaponry, they have a surprising amount of cohabitation options. However, we're not going to be using any today. In the Zoopedia, we learned that anteaters can't climb, and this is 100% correct. However, they probably realistically could get over this tiny 1-foot gap that separates their habitat from the path. Because of this, I think the best possible barrier for the giant anteater is going to be a moat. In order to build an effective moat, we're going to have to get the elevation down for the rest of the build first. Realistically, the only thing that we have to do is make the pond a little bit bigger so water can actually flow from the waterfall. I think this is going to be adequate. In terms of shaping the actual moat, the first thing I always like to do is use the push terrain feature. After I get the terrain going down a little bit, not a whole lot quite yet, I'm then going to transition to the flatten to foundation feature. This is an incredibly useful one because it's going to make the ground entirely flat exactly where you want it, leveling it to the foundation. For now, all we have to worry about is the basic shape. We can worry about the depth later when we actually go to detail the thing. If you ever do build a moat of your own, it's recommended to do it around the base game paths. This is because the paths restrict the flatten to foundation feature, and you can get really close to the path, but it's entirely even since you can't actually touch it. Now that we have the layout of the moat perfectly dug into the ground exactly how we want it, we can use the exact same technique of using both the push feature and flatten to foundation to make it as deep as we want it. This is by far the easiest step of the process because all we're doing is just tracing what we've already dug. Now the entire point of a moat is to eventually have water in it, and the water level is perfect because even if the anteater did somehow jump in here, it won't be able to swim out to the other side. Naturally, I added some mist effects to the water. I think it looks really nice, and there's no way the anteater is going to be able to escape. The entire point of building a moat is to have great sightlines of your animal. We don't have to have a giant fence to contain the anteater because the natural barrier is doing it for us. That being said, we still do actually need a habitat gate, so we can't make a moat around the entire exhibit. Since a lot of this exhibit is covered by either the moat or the back of the reptile house, we're going to be using a lot of null barriers. 9 times out of 10, when I'm building a habitat, I really like to have a reference picture, usually from somewhere where I've been personally. Today we're going to be building from Disney's Animal Kingdom. They have a really nice giant anteater enclosure. The main point of reference is that they also use a moat, which is exactly where I got the idea from. To further detail the moat, I'm thinking we should start from the bottom up, and the furthest point down in the moat is going to be the bottom, or the bed of the river. I'm thinking a very thin layer of these cladding rocks is going to do perfectly fine. After the bottom layer was set, I tried to do the corners of the moat. This was almost like building a puzzle, trying to match the outline of the moat with some big rocks. During this entire build process, we're mainly going to be sticking to 2 species of rocks. The one are these dynamic mossy rocks. They're incredibly interesting because no matter which way you rotate them, the moss is always on the top. I actually find this out later in the video and I didn't know it before. The second look like these, but without the moss. They're just the tropical rocks. By far, the hardest part of this build process was to get these two species of rocks to work together. Like I said before, I want this build to look incredibly lush, and you saw the reference images. That being said, I don't want every square inch of this to be covered in foliage, so we're going to have a lot of areas where we don't necessarily use the dynamic mossy rocks. Once we built an effective retaining wall holding all of the dirt back, I then used some really small rocks to blend it into the bottom of the moat. Finally, after that was done, I used the smooth terrain feature just to make sure the ground is perfectly flat. Now that the terrain was perfectly flat and smooth, we could then use some smaller and thinner rocks to blend the rock formation into the terrain. These thin rocks are actually much more important than they may appear to be, because they're going to allow the anteater to actually step really close to the moat. Before this, the bigger rocks might have impeded his traversal area. However, now these small rocks are going to let him walk all over it. Despite only having one side of the moat officially complete, I think you should be able to see the bigger picture now. The challenge is going to come from duplicating this over to the other side, but maintaining the relative shape and structure of the moat. This side was a little bit more challenging because we had to take into account that the path is there. We couldn't let the rocks overlay into the path, and we couldn't let the rocks overhang too much, otherwise it would overtake a lot of the moat, and then it would kind of defeat the purpose of having the moat here in general. However, by utilizing a variety of different shapes and the types of rocks, we were able to make a really convincing shape. At this point we were incredibly ahead of schedule, so I added in some details that really wouldn't be added until the end usually, like this vent that the water can flow from. Naturally, we also use some special effects. These water stream ones really help sell the illusion that this is a flowing moat and not just a body of stagnant water. I'm actually really happy with how this moat turned out. It looks a little bit barren right now, but once we add some foliage, it's really going to kick it up a notch. For now, I think we should work on the sightlines of the exhibit, and I have two in mind. If you'll recall from the reference image, the moat and foliage are definitely the main aspects of this build, but nobody's really looking at the fence. It's really just a simple wooden fence, so let's adapt it. I didn't necessarily take the bamboo-inspired route that our inspiration picture used. Instead, I went with an incredibly simple design using very simple pieces from the base game. From here, I used the advanced move and duplicate option, and then moved the fence over to exactly where I needed it to go. I did this twice, once on the left and once on the right. Unfortunately, not everything you make is going to be 100% perfect on the first try. For example, in this build currently, the rocks were a little bit too close to the path, and the fence didn't really look good as a result. All I had to do was kick the rocks back and make sure they didn't really come over the path. Easily the hardest part of this entire build was figuring out how to cover up the facade of the reptile house. This was really challenging, mainly because it's so tall. On the side nearest to the entrance of the reptile house and beginning of the rainforest, I used very similar rock techniques that we used on the moat to make a planter. Like I mentioned before, I want this area to be overwhelmingly lush. It's called the rainforest after all, so expect a lot more of these planters all around. The first planter actually ended up coming a little bit over the moat. This is actually fine. I didn't intend for it to work this way, but I really like how it looks because it makes this one particular section of the moat a little bit taller. It got so tall in fact, we added another mini planter on top of it. On the channel, I often stress just how important first impressions are, and realistically, 50% of the people that visit South America are going to enter the rainforest first. The other half might go to the Amazon, but it's crucially important that we get this right. So far, I think we're doing a really good job. It's a basic build, but it looks really nice regardless. Basic does not mean under-detailed, and even without the foliage, I actually really like how this moat turned out. It's probably one of my favorite aspects of Keystone Park. The mist effects, the water special effects, and even the vent decal, it all comes together and makes a really coherent build. There is one elephant in the room, however, and it's that we used a lot of faux rocks in the waterfall. This doesn't really match what we've been doing lately, so let's change it. One of the most difficult and painful things to do in any video game, but especially sandbox games like Planet Zoo, is admit when you are wrong, and deleting your builds is a prime example of this. It can suck, because this waterfall did genuinely take me a little bit of time to design, and I do really like the design of the faux rocks around it. However, it simply just doesn't fit with what we're doing now, so we have to get rid of it and make it better. Let's get to it! We're using a very similar technique to how we designed the moat, however instead of using the dynamic mossy rocks, we're just using the simple mossy rocks. The main difference between the two is that these ones are entirely covered in moss, and they don't have any of the other color peeking through. That's not to say I don't want the tropical rocks to have any representation here. Matter of fact, I want them to have a lot. However, the mossy rock and the dynamic mossy rock only has the moss on the top, not the sides, so we had to get creative with how we implemented this. What we ended up doing was using a lot more of the tropical rocks than the mossy rocks. We just left some gaps open to where the mossy rock would still appear. We used this strategy to build this all the way up to the peak of the waterfall. It definitely looks a lot different than it did before, and I think I like it a lot better. We built it so high, we were able to add a lot more planters. We're going to have a lot of room for various trees of all different kinds. This is going to be called the rainforest after all, and rainforest, if they're known for one thing besides rain, it's a lot of plants. You know, in hindsight, that was a perfect transition into the foliage portion, but unfortunately, we have to deal with this wall first. This walkthrough exhibit door is actually a base game piece, and it's one of my favorite parts in the entire game. It looks really nice, and it actually has an animation allowing the animals to walk through it. I'm surprised I haven't used it yet in Keystone Park. It's one of my most favorite pieces. All we did to implement it was put it right in the middle of that large doorway we already had pre-built. After that, I used the exact same pieces that we used to line the outside of the reptile house, lined them up to make sure that annoying glitch that makes everything have a seizure when you put it on top of each other doesn't happen, and then cover up the PVC strip. Side note, if you don't know what I'm talking about, look at the parking lot right in the middle of the screen right now. This is one of the most annoying glitches in the game, and one of the only things that I really don't like about Planet Zoo. Frontier, please fix this. Anyways, after spending 20 minutes to make sure that glitch didn't happen, I simply used the advanced movement menu and duplicated it over to the other side. If you couldn't tell already, this is going to be the backstage for the Anteater. They're not necessarily prone to stress, but they're going to need a hard shelter. This should be plenty of space for them. Remember, anteaters are solitary, there's only going to be one in this habitat. The build is incredibly detailed on 3 of the 4 sides. Let's worry about that 4th side now. I'm thinking we can add another sightline, because currently we only have one, and it's the main sightline. This one's going to be a bit smaller, and reuse a lot of techniques, so it should be pretty easy and fast. The first thing that we did was use a lot of large-scale rocks to build up the side closest to the gate. After that, we came in with some smaller rocks and built up the connection point between the moat and the path. Finally, we used the exact same fence as before, put it into position, and officially created the second sightline. I would say the build is 100% done, minus the foliage. It's probably about time we get to that, we've been putting it off for a while. Even though it's technically not considered foliage, I always like to do the terrain at this portion of the build. This is because I use the terrain as almost a blueprint of where the foliage is actually going to go. What I mean by this is we started off and everything was the light soil. This is fine, but I want the light soil to be mainly where the Anteater is going to walk. I use the heavy soil to transition between the rock and the light soil, and I place grass in between where I want there to be buffalo grass later. This may seem like an extra and almost tedious step, but I promise you, it makes the foliage process so much easier in the long run. This is almost crucial to do. After the terrain is in place, the next step I always take is detailing up anything that has to do with water. For example, currently, I decided to do the bottom of the pond. The reason why I like to detail these up first is because this is often one of the most eye-catching parts of the entire exhibit, so you have to get this right, so you might as well do it first when you're putting in your most effort possible. Typically, waterways are also in the dead center of the exhibit, so this also gives you something to work off of. By starting in the middle of the exhibit, it almost makes it easier to detail everything else because you're building out from a focal point. It makes it a lot easier to make everything feel connected and more like it's all part of the same habitat, and not a lot of different building styles clashing together. That being said, having a couple of building styles clash together isn't necessarily a bad thing. For example, in the Amazon River portion of the build, we used a lot of these bramble bushes peeking in and out of the rocks. I decided to do that exact same thing here to help transition the two areas. I spent a lot of time trying to perfect the sightlines of the fences, and the way we're going to accomplish this now is actually by obstructing every single other sightline. We don't want people to see the anteaters from locations we don't necessarily plan for, so in order to do this, we're going to add a ton of really thick foliage everywhere else except where the fences are. After a lot of trial and error, I eventually decided that placing trees really deep into the ground, making them act more like bushes instead of trees, was the best way to accomplish this. I also wanted to say I'm well aware that a lot of DLC packs include different types of foliage. The Conservation pack is probably the only other notable one in my opinion. However, the plants that come in the South America pack are absolutely top-notch. I especially like all the flowers. Earlier in the build, I was struggling a lot with the facade of the reptile house, and I didn't really want to use the wallpaper trick on both sides of the building, so I decided just to throw in some of these vines as placeholders, but I eventually liked how they looked so much I kept them. Lastly, it's basically a felony at this point if you don't detail up your grass. I like to use buffalo grass personally, but a lot of other options are available if you have the Conservation pack. If you use the terrain technique and place the grass where you already want the buffalo grass, this step becomes infinitely easier. It's the main reason why I do it, and it saves a lot of time, because really all we're doing is covering up the grass that we already placed with a more detailed version. It's absolutely incredible how much a basic amount of foliage can absolutely turn a build into something spectacular. I'm really happy with this. I would consider the exterior of the build 100% done. The only thing we have to do left is fix up the inside, and then make the facade of the reptile house a little bit more polished. Finalizing the facade was actually the easy part. All we did was take some ivy, rotate it in increments of 90 degrees, and place it over the vines that we already used, making it look like a custom plant of sorts. We did this a lot, and surprisingly, not to spoil anything, this build only took up 1% on the complexity meter, which I was absolutely shocked by. I really liked the ivy, so I decided to add even more of it, but the problem is I ran out of places. To fix this, I added a second place. I added this Planet Zoo log to the top of the build, to make it look a little bit more like a jungle. The way I accomplished this is I added even more ivy going off of it. Now we basically have 3 layers of ivy, adding a ton of depth. In that glass, they may look like windows, but they're actually not. It's just black concrete behind the wall. It's an illusion. The facade looks 100 times better, and we really didn't do too much to it. We pretty much just detailed it up 3 times more than we already had with the exact same pieces. But now we really need to work on the backstage. I spent a while trying to figure out what exactly to do with the backstage, and eventually I realized that we don't necessarily have to do anything too complicated. We can keep it simple. Wood floor, cover the walls. I just received word that the Anteater is on its way, so we need to get some enrichment items in. Unfortunately, this termite mound just didn't fit. Luckily, this water pipe did, and it fit in the backstage, so it's out of the guest's eye, because I kinda think it's an ugly piece personally. We'll make the Anteater a nice custom bed right next to its water pipe and food bowl. We were also able to fit a forage pool in the water. This made the water look better in general, but now it's actually functional. Lastly, a rubbing pad and a door finish the build. Welcome to Keystone Park, and remember, if you have any good names for a male giant anteater, leave them in the comments below. I can't explain why whatsoever, and I've really thought about it, but this is my most anticipated DLC animal by far. 1 second, Anteater, just give me a quick pose for the thumbnail, please. And it looks like we got the traversal area correct on our very first try. The moat works. The Anteater spent his first few hours living at Keystone Park thoroughly exploring his habitat. One thing that I actually did learn about Anteaters just by watching him walk around is they actually walk on their knuckles, not to dull their claws. Look how sharp they are. After some time to adjust, the Anteater had his first check-in with the zookeeper, but unfortunately, a mysterious call came in, taking their attention away from the Anteater's habitat. We'll get to that in the next episode. I wonder what could be more important than watching a new animal adjust. I guess we'll just have to watch him for now. It can't be that hard. He seems pretty tired right now anyways. It looks like he's going down for a nap. Interesting, he's using his tail as a blanket. Due to their diet of eating almost exclusively insects, Anteaters have to sleep a lot to maintain their metabolism. This doesn't mean they're not capable of bursts of speed. But as soon as they wake up, they're right back to looking for insects. The Giant Anteater has to be one of my favorite animated animals in the game. Their sound design is also top tier. They're incredibly quiet. Since they walk on their knuckles, they're extremely silent while moving, so you can almost hear them breathing. Unfortunately, I think we're going to have to call it for today's episode. It's running a little bit long as it is. Let me know what you think of the habitat in the comments below, and let me know what animal you think is coming next. Any suggestions are welcome. I love the community input. It looks like our Giant Anteater is finally away for the day. We should probably get going too. Kingpin out. See you next week!